I'll introduce myself for those of you who haven't seen a Sappy before. My name is Emily Rondel. I'm just kind of helping out a little bit tonight. I'm an Atlas volunteer and one of the regional coordinators. And we have presentations by two of our regular panel members. First is Mike Cadman, who's going to be sharing a screen in a second, talking about, I believe, some early season atlasing and tips and tricks to remember. Is that right, Mike? Cadman?
Yeah, that's the general idea, Emily.
Okay, just making sure I got it right. We also have Mike Burrell, and he has an extra interactive portion for you tonight. He's going to be presenting on breeding codes, because I know that for a lot of us who are interested in atlasing and interested in birding in general, the breeding codes are the part that we haven't really encountered before if we're new to atlasing. So Mike will be doing a bit of an interactive quiz, and we'll describe how to do that when we come to it. Mike Burrell, did I cover that properly? Does that make sense?
Yep. If it doesn't make sense to you, then you gotta sit and wait for another 10 minutes or so.
All will be revealed. Okay, excellent. So with that, let's hand it over to Mike Cadman, and yeah, we can get our first presentation going and learn about early season atlasing.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Emily. I'm gonna share my screen. Get that going, put it into presentation. And
looks
okay,
good.
Away we go. Just great. Okay, hopefully everyone could see that well. The important thing here is our email and website addresses. So please let us know if you've got if you want to follow up on anything today with any more questions or any concerns. Do what you can on the website and let us know if you can't find the answer there. So I'm just going to outline a little bit about what you can do in these early months of the year. And I hope everybody's getting out there right now. It's a fantastic time to be atlasing. I mean, there's a lot of the birds aren't back yet, but that in some ways makes it even better for certain things. So one of the nice things is the leaves aren't out yet, so you can see much better. The birds that are around tend to be very vocal and easy to see. And so it's a good chance to be learning about your birds and learning about atlasing. So one of the first things I want to mention is that this time of year, when you are going to go atlasing, one of the key things is try and focus in on the species that are hard to find later. And I'll go into a few more slides on that one in a second. But then just skipping down here, you want to explore your square, get to know your square. And when I say your square, I mean, if you're a principal atlaser, go out and learn your square. If you're not, if you're a freelance type atlaser, then you're free to go anywhere. Just look for special places, neat places they can be in, close to home, further away, whatever works for you to get out into places that are going to be rich for birds. And look for these kind of places. Look for the special places in the square: marshes, swamps, bogs, ponds, all the wetland types, rich in different kinds of birds. Look for riparian areas. Where can you get? Where's the spots that the roads cross the rivers and the creeks that you can get easy access to good habitat? Check the map and look for large patches of habitat. There are lots of species, and a lot of the rarer species that tend to focus on the biggest patches, the biggest areas of these habitats. So there are forest specialists that require large forests, grassland birds that require extensive areas of grassland. And spend some time this time of year, before the great rush of birds is back, marking those on your map and finding where those are so you can go back and visit them later. Also have a look for eBird hotspots. Obviously go on to eBird, or you can go on to the Atlas website, call up the map of your square, and you'll be able to see the eBird hotspots on there. And I'll show you a couple of slides about that in a while. But spend the time also looking for places that you're going to be able to access. A lot of private land, especially in Southern Ontario, makes it difficult to get at certain types of habitat. So try and find out the best ways to get to the different habitat patches that you can see, the places that you really want to get at. Obviously look for trails and that kind of thing that are going to get you in there. We have a landowner letter on the website, and I'm honestly not quite sure if it's there or it's going to be there very soon, but you can print that out. And if you find a property that you'd really like to get into, and there's a mailbox there, put a copy of the letter in the mailbox. The letter can be personalized with your information, the landowner can contact you if they're interested in letting you on there, and really encourage you to be doing that kind of thing at this time of year. And then also this time of year is a great time to learn your bird songs. If you're working on that, refresh if you know them. But if you're newer to birding, this is a great time to learn, because the great mass of birds aren't back yet. So learn the ones that are here at the moment. They're often here in good numbers. And that's a great way to prepare yourself for when the birds that come along later that you don't know, that you don't recognize, that you'll be able to track down the ones that you don't recognize. And of course, it's also a great time of year to be using things like Dendroica and the other resources we mentioned on the website to learn more about the birds, and especially use rainy days and evenings and such to catch up on your bird song. And then use the square summary sheet on the Atlas website. And it will give you good information on what birds occur in your region, which birds occurred in your square last time. And that's going to be very helpful in focusing your effort. Then you can sit down with your map and figure out which places you need to get to try and at least match the species that we got last time, and hopefully improve on that. So I wanted to go back to this idea of looking for birds that are easier to find at this time of year than later. And one of the obvious groups there is woodpeckers. A lot of the woodpeckers are drumming and calling at this time of year, their territorial calls. And if you go out in June, the woodpeckers are silent. They're hard to find. So now is a great time to be, especially because there's no leaves on the trees, looking for woodpeckers and some of the other birds that are very active at this time of year that tend to be quiet later. The owls, I'm pointing here to the barred owl. We talked last time about the owl surveys. Good time to be doing owl surveys and getting those species. Birds like woodcock, very active through April and May, but less so later on. So try and get out early and get those birds on territories, get them displaying. The goshawk and the other accipiters are active this time of year. They're building nests, or some of them now are on nests, but they're often doing their flight displays at this time of year. Once they get really settled into the breeding season, they stop doing that, and they're much harder to find. So get out into areas, look for coniferous habitats, try and find good views so you can see what's above the coniferous habitats. If you can get on a hillside or something and scan over a large area, you might be lucky and find goshawks and Cooper's hawks in particular doing their butterfly flights, deep winged flights over their nesting sites. Red-shouldered hawk, another bird, very active when they first come back in the spring, and very vocal, and much better chance of getting them this time of year than later on. Just a couple of others. This year in particular, the siskins are certainly in our area around Guelph are just still everywhere. Seems likely they're going to be breeding this year. They sort of move around, and some years they don't breed in this area at all. But this year it's looking really good. Still lots of them, quite a bit of singing going on. So good time of year to be going out, looking for those singing birds, marking locations where they are, and going back later to see if there's still activity there. Some of the waterfowl, the wood ducks and the hooded mergansers, are now starting to look for nesting sites. So you see pairs of birds in wooded swamps in really nice looking habitat for them. Good time of year to be looking for them. You got to be cautious with the waterfowl, of course, because they will pair up before they arrive on their breeding grounds. But still, this time of year, it starts to get to the time when they are actually starting to pick out nest sites. I don't know if you've noticed, I noticed the last few days, there were pairs of mallards everywhere. Well, the last few days, I've started to see lots of single male mallards, suggesting that the females are already sitting on nests. So lots of good things already starting to happen. I should mention, just for the sharp-shinned hawk, they do the same kind of thing as the larger accipiters, but they tend to go very early in the morning. So if you are out very early, look for that same kind of behavior with the sharp-shins, but soon after dawn. Okay, so this is really just a reminder to use your map, print your map off from the from the website, carry it around with you, but mark those locations that you want to visit and check them all out at this time of year, again, before the bulk of the birds are back. Look for spots that are going to be good for finding a variety of species. And then I mentioned the eBird hotspots. If you go on the website on the Square Resources page, you can pull up a map like this that shows you both the point count locations and the hotspot locations in your square. And those obviously are going to be areas to concentrate your efforts. And I mentioned the square summary sheets. This is what it looks like. If you haven't seen one, pull one up. And as you can see, it's got information there on the list of species shown is all the species that bred in that region last time. And the previous column there is the breeding codes in your square last time. And then the code column there shows whatever evidence has already been reported in that square. So just a lot of really useful information, and would encourage you to follow up on that. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to say about early season nesting, and open up to your questions, I think, later, and maybe just hand things off to Mike right now. I'll just stop sharing. Mike, are you able to pick it up?
Yep, thanks, Mike. All right, let me share mine. All right, how's that look, Mike?
Looks good.
Okay, so yeah, Mike was showing a fair bit of the safe date, breeding date calendar. And so I want to talk more about that. We've got a lot of questions, or we have gotten a lot of questions about the safe dates and when to record breeding evidence, if it's outside of the safe dates or it's outside of the breeding dates, and all those sorts of things. So I was hoping to go through some of the details on that. This is the breeding calendar that you may have come across already. It's got a lot of information packed in here, and at first glance, I think it can be a bit overwhelming for some people. So don't feel bad if that's you. There's a lot to process. So to better understand what this calendar is showing, I wanted to walk you through how it was that we actually created these calendars. So I'm going to show you an example for this lovely bird, the scarlet tanager. So the first thing we had to do was to come up with what is the nesting season. And so for the nesting season, we're defining that as the period of time when birds have a nest that is active. So from the first date that the first egg is laid to the date when the last young leaves the nest. And to get the dates for all the different birds across the province, we used a really awesome tool that's available out there called the Nesting Calendar Query Tool. That's available from Birds Canada, and it's based on a model that was developed by Rousseau and Drolet in 2015, and it uses Project NestWatch database information from that database, which includes all of the Ontario Nest Record Scheme data. So from this source, we are able to estimate the period between when 10% of the nests have their first egg to when 90% of the nests have fledged within any given little section of the province. So we divide the province into 3 major ecozones, and then we look at the dates. So for scarlet tanager, our dates are May 20th to July 14th. So this, based on a huge database of nest records, is the dates when we can expect scarlet tanager to have a nest with eggs or young in it. So the next thing we had to do was figure out what's the entire breeding season of the species. So we took our nesting dates and we used the scientific literature to estimate how many days before and after the nesting period is each species active in terms of breeding activity. So this could be things like attracting a mate, setting up territories, claiming territories, building nest, and feeding dependent young. So for scarlet tanager, for our example, if you look through the literature, the males typically arrive on their territory first, set up their territories. That can take up to a week. Then the females arrive afterwards. There's courtship. and that can take up to a week. And then there's the nest building period, which takes usually 3 to 4 days. So in total, we're looking at 9 to 18 days before the first egg is laid from when breeding behavior begins. So the average there is 13 and a half, which we round to 14. Then on the other end of the breeding season, we have the young remaining within the territory for about 2 weeks. And at that time, they're still being fed by both parents before they disperse. So we've got a 14-day period, in this case, after the nesting season as well. So when you add that up, then you end up with a breeding season for scarlet tanagers in Southern Ontario from May 6th to July 28th. Okay, now the last stage to creating these calendars was to figure out when is the bird migrating, when is the species migrating, because we have to take that into consideration. So we use things like eBird and other data sources to figure out what is the migration window for that given species. So for scarlet tanager, we've got an estimated migration period of about May 1st to May 24th in the spring, and July 29th to August 5th in the fall. So we put them all together, and this is what we end up with. So go back, we've got that breeding season, which was May 6th to July 28th. That's the blue, light and dark blue. And we've got our migration seasons. So we have spring migration, May 1st to the 24th, and then fall migration, July 29th to August 5th. And in the spring, you can see that little bit of overlap where the spring migration overlaps with the start of the breeding season. That's the light blue section. The part where it doesn't overlap is the dark blue, and that is what we call the safe dates. So in the case of the scarlet tanager, our safe dates are May 24th to July 28th. And that's the period of time when it's generally safe to assume that any bird you observe is indeed a breeder, and you can rule out the possibility of a migrant. It's not 100%, but it's pretty good. So if you want to access those safe date breeding date calendars, it's found on the website under Tools and Resources, and there's an option called Safe Breeding Dates, and we actually have them available in taxonomic order or chronological order. So the early breeders are listed first. Now, moving on to our breeding codes and how those sort of interact with our breeding dates. If you open up the appendix, sorry, I had to point that out. On this page, you can access the Appendix H, which is the Safe Dates Breeding Dates document, and gives you more information about how to interpret those. But as part of that, we have a section in that document called Breeding Codes and When to Use Them. And again, we've got, it can be a little overwhelming at first, but the general idea is we have our least confident breeding evidence, so our possibles up at the top, and our more confident breeding evidence codes, the confirmed ones, down at the bottom. And essentially, the idea is as you work your way down the list of breeding codes, we're more confident that the bird is actually breeding and not just something like a migrant going through. So in that document, we break down the different codes and when you can use them in relation to the breeding dates and the safe dates. So things like X and H, which is for habitat, or S for singing, and M, which is multiple singing birds. Those ones you should really only use during the safe dates, because they're behaviors that aren't necessarily just restricted to the breeding, to a breeding bird. So, you know, you could have a migrant in your backyard, a migrant scarlet tanager could be singing. That doesn't necessarily tell you for sure it's breeding. So if it's outside of the safe dates, then you don't want to use the code. As you work your way down through the codes, you get things like the pair code, territory code, display, and those ones you can use outside of the safe dates, but you want to be extra sure. So you want to be a little more confident that it is in fact a breeding bird at that location. But generally, you can assume that if you're seeing these behavior codes, even outside of the safe dates, but still within the breeding season. And then once you work your way down to the very bottom, you have things like nest building. And obviously, if you see a bird building a nest, then that's pretty good indication that it is going to breed there. And so you can use that anytime during the breeding season. And of course, you might even be able to use it outside of the breeding season if you find a really rare case of a bird doing that outside of that season. So I thought the best way to go through these was to go through it with some examples, and we're going to get into the interactive part where we do some polling. So the first one I wanted to give was the first scenario was this guy, the American woodcock. And Emily, were you going to pop up with the poll?
Yeah, I can do that right now. So do you want to explain a little bit about it first, or should I just start us off?
Yeah, sure. So okay, great. Yeah, there it pops up. So we're going to give you a few seconds here to answer the question. Don't worry, we don't know who answered what, so you're not going to like get penalized if you get the wrong answer. And once you've put in your answer and we've got enough, then we'll work our way through the answer. So the question is for this scenario is you step outside, maybe after the Sappy hour call tonight, you step outside and there's an American woodcock doing a flight display. What breeding evidence code would you use? So your options are A, leave it blank, X, the breeding, because the breeding season, it's the breeding season, but you didn't have any breeding evidence. D, so courtship or display, or S, singing.
Sounds
we'll
good.
Give you 10 seconds.
Yeah, we'll give you a few seconds just to kind of mull it over. If you are watching on Facebook right now, good point that just put you can't see the actual physical poll, but maybe put the answer that you think is the correct one into the comments, and we will share the right answer with you as well. I know it's a little confusing because we are doing this through two different mediums at once. And Mike, you said that this is happening at this date, right? So we do know the date.
Yeah.
The date. Okay. Okay.
That's a good point. It is April 13th. Yeah.
Okay. In our fake scenario, it is the same date as our real scenario. Awesome. I'm going to close the poll in 4, 3, 2. Get your votes in. I can only see 84% of you voted. 1. And I'm going to share the results. So if you're on Facebook, you won't be able to see this, but I will say that 0% of you said to leave it blank. Overwhelmingly, around 80% of people who responded said D. And that's kind of consistent with what we saw on Facebook too. And then we had around equal, smaller amounts saying S and X.
Okay, cool. All right. So I'm not going to reveal the answer quite yet. We're going to work our way through the answer. So the first step, when we're doing atlasing at this time of year, we're not into like the core breeding season yet, then we really do need to make frequent use of our safe dates charts. So I'm going to flip over to the section of the chart that has American woodcock. There it is. So there's American woodcock. I've highlighted it there at the bottom. And so for woodcock, the safe dates are, and this is for the mixed wood plain ecozone. So that is something to consider. I'm assuming you're in the mixed wood plain, but it might be different if you're outside of that. So the safe dates are April 10th to July 14th. So we're in the safe date. So we can ignore the rest of it in this scenario. So we're in the safe date, so that's good. That means we can use any of the breeding codes because we're in the safe dates. Now this one is a very tricky bird because there's another rule that we have to take into consideration. And if you don't know this rule, that's fine. You would figure the rule out when you go to do data entry. So if you tried to put the D code when you are doing your data entry, either on the website or the app, you would get a little yellow exclamation mark that would pop up beside your data entry. And if you clicked on that, you would see some special rules related to American woodcock. And so actually each species has a set of rules on certain codes you can't use or certain codes you shouldn't use. So for American woodcock with the code D, we actually have the rule that the woodcock's display ritual counts as S rather than D, unless there's interaction with conspecifics observed. So if you saw, two males displaying next to each other, or you saw another bird sitting there watching, then you could use D. But in our scenario, In this case, because we only had one, although maybe I didn't specify that, because we only had one, the correct answer was actually S, so you'd use the singing code. And so if you were a few days earlier outside of the safe dates, then you wouldn't use that S code because we were outside of the safe dates. Instead, you should leave it blank if we were a few days earlier, and wait until the bird has stuck around for at least a week. Okay, so let's try a different one. Now this is another scenario where you're going to assume you're in the mixed wood plain ecozone, and it's today's date, April 13th. And the scenario is, and Emily, you can pop up the quiz for those of us on Zoom. The scenario is you're driving along and a mourning dove is sitting on a telephone wire. What breeding evidence code do you use? You can leave it blank. You can use X because it's the breeding season, but you didn't observe breeding evidence, H for habitat, or S for singing. Give you a few seconds.
Yeah, we can see that around 25% of people voted. They're slower this time because you tricked them last time and most of them put the wrong answer. So they're taking their time and thinking it through. And those of you on Facebook got pretty much the same answer as those on Zoom. So there's no difference there. But yeah, if you are on Facebook, pop your guess, or maybe it's not a guess, into the chat too. But we're going to close the poll officially in, I'm going to give you 3, 2, 1. Going to end polling and I'm going to share the results. So, okay, a little bit more right away as before, there was one answer that nobody put, and that was S for singing, which was the right answer last time. Most people, almost half, said X. You put that the bird is there in the breeding season, but no breeding evidence. But it almost tied with H for habitat, which is what you would, I guess, say when the bird is physically in a location in the breeding season. And then 20% said to leave the whole thing blank. So.
All right. I'm going to leave you all in suspense again. So the first step again, we're going to check the breeding chart for mourning dove in the mixed wood plain ecozone. So mourning dove highlighted at the top there. So the breeding season goes from late February to end of October, and the safe dates run from March 15th to September 30th. So we're safely within the safe dates. So that's good. That means we can use any codes within for that species. So because we're within breeding season, we know it's not leave blank because we have observed the bird within the breeding season, and we have observed some breeding evidence. And the breeding evidence we've observed in this case is that the bird is in breeding habitat. Now, I guess technically you wouldn't know that based on the photo, but I guess I should have said you assume there's some sort of mourning dove habitat within the immediate vicinity, which pretty much any part of Southern Ontario would be. So in this case, the correct answer, so 38% of you got it right, is H for habitat. Okay, we got 2 more to go through and then we'll open up for questions. So the next one is a fun example because I bet you a lot of you are getting this right now. This is the Eastern Phoebe, and Emily, you can pop up the question for the Zoom participants. Okay, so the scenario is you step outside anytime today, and outside there's an Eastern Phoebe singing in your backyard or out your window or in your local park or whatever. What breeding evidence code would you use in this scenario? So you can leave it blank. You can put X because it's the breeding season, but there's no breeding evidence. You can use S for singing, or you can use T for territory.
Okay. The majority have gotten both wrong though, so I think everybody needs a win right now. Thinking through, although I think we're getting some good practice. I can see some of the votes coming in. People are voting slower. They're taking their time. They've been burned before. We have a lot of S guesses on Facebook, but I'm going to close the poll in a moment. So I'm going to count you guys down with 4, 3, 2, 1.5, 1, 0. Okay. And so the results for those of you who can't see the poll result on Facebook is more than half of you, just like on Facebook, but on Zoom too, guessed S for singing. That's 53%. Another quarter just said to leave it blank. 17% said that this bird is on territory, so T. And then just a few, 5% said it's an X, so it's in the breeding season, but with no breeding evidence.
Okay. All right. So let's work our way through this one again. So remember, we're in our shoulder season, so we've got to check our breeding calendar. And I know all of you working on this at home don't have the luxury of really quickly flipping through this, so that's okay. So let's head over to our breeding chart, and Eastern Phoebe's down there way near the bottom. And so the safe dates for Eastern Phoebe are April 30th to August 12th, and the breeding season stretches to the start of April. So we're in the breeding season, but we're outside of the safe. So because we're outside of the safe date, we need to take into consideration that we don't know if it's a migrant or not. So we want to be extra sure when we use our breeding evidence codes to take that into consideration. So remember back to the different codes and when to use them outside of the safe dates. So things like H and S, which are habitat and singing bird, those are codes that we don't want to use outside of the safe dates because they're behaviors that could be exhibited by migrants that are passing through. So in the case of this Phoebe, we want to be cautious because we're outside of the safe dates. So the correct answer is to leave it blank. The S code would be appropriate only during the safe dates because we want to make sure that it is in fact a breeding bird that's singing, not just a migrant that's passing through. The T code is an interesting one because we could use that at this time of year if that bird had been present for at least a week. So if we're sure that that bird has been present in the same spot, singing away for at least a week, then you can use the territory code if you're reasonably sure that it's a breeder at that location. Okay, we've got one more to give it a go. And Emily, you can pop this one up. Okay, so this one is yellow rumped warbler, and very similar to the Eastern Phoebe. And we're assuming it's this time of year. There's been a yellow rumped warbler and it's been singing in your backyard for the past 7 days. What breeding evidence code do you use? So same choices as last time. You can leave it blank. You can use X for that it's within the breeding season, but there's no breeding evidence. And you can use S for singing bird or T for territory.
Okay, excellent. I think people are getting it. I'm seeing some confident answers on Facebook that have like exclamation points after them now. So I feel like people are really learning. They're confident. They're excited. People.
And keep in mind, to correctly answer this, you technically do need to know exactly what the breeding season is for the species. So you need to know 2 pieces of information. You need to know about the breeding evidence codes and what they mean, but you also need to know the breeding season. So if you don't have that right in front of you, then you probably don't know the breeding season, which puts you at a disadvantage.
Definitely. But part of what makes it fun, right? Just a little bit of guessing. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll pretty soon. We've got a lot of votes in, actually. So get them in another 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to end the poll. And I'm going to share the results. And I feel like we finally cracked it, Mike, although I know you'll reveal it later. Most people said T for territory, and that's similar to what happened on Facebook as well. It was a close second because 41% said leave it blank, and then smaller amounts both for S for singing and X for, the bird is within the breeding season, but there is no breeding evidence.
All right, yeah, that's a real close one, almost a 50-50 split. Okay, so remember now, the first thing we need to do, because we're in the shoulder season, is we need to check the date guide. So let's check that out, see what it says. All right, so yellow rumped warbler. So according to our breeding chart, the breeding season starts in early May and goes till mid-August, and the safe dates are from May 24th to July 31st. So we are outside of the breeding season for yellow rumped warbler. We are only in migration window. Therefore, the correct answer is leave it blank. Now, this was a bit of a trick one because that last one with Phoebe, we were within the breeding season. So that's why this one's slightly different than that Phoebe example. And then, of course, because it's been present for 7 days, that was just a red herring to throw you off the scent of the true answer. Now, if we were within the breeding season for Yellow Rumped Warbler and it had been present for 7 days, then you could use the T code. So I feel like I made those questions way harder than they should have been. But I know I've learned my lesson. And hopefully everybody has got a sense of the importance of referring back and forth to the date guide. So just to wrap, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. No, I was just saying, I think it's actually really helpful to have the really difficult questions now, as opposed to kind of scratching your head later, but that's all.
Yeah, and it's all about working through it, and it should become pretty intuitive pretty quickly. And it's a lot simpler in the core breeding season when you don't need to worry about breeding seasons and safe dates and things like that. So just to wrap it up, I just wanted to emphasize a few things. So the charts are meant to be a guide, and they're our first crack at these dates and safe dates. So we'll probably continue to update them as we get new information, but use them as a guide. Don't use them as like hard rules necessarily in terms of, if it's a day early or a day late kind of thing. There's going to be exceptions for sure. The other thing to keep in mind is that these are based on the 3 major ecozones of Ontario. So those cover really big areas. And if you're at the very southern edge of the Boreal Shield ecozone, you might end up being closer in terms of the dates to the Mixedwood Plain. And if you're at the north edge, then you might be more on the later edge of the dates. You should remember to refer to the date guide whenever you're outside of the core breeding season. So, this time of year. And if you are going to report any codes outside of the date guides, then make sure you include notes to justify why you did that. And please submit feedback to us to help us improve the dates. That's it. Hopefully we've got lots of questions, I'm sure, have built up. So I'll end the slideshow.
Okay, Mike Cadman has to come back from wherever he's been hiding for the last little while too, because we've got a lot of questions for everybody, and some of them are pretty good. Some people are a little scared. They say they're just going to email their RC after they see every single bird because they don't know what code to put anymore, but I think we can train them out of that. First question is just a little bit of a clarification between kind of the concept of a breeding season generally and, the safe dates specifically. So Mike Cadman, actually, because you've had a bit of a break for a while, do you want to just kind of distinguish between those two terms, safe dates and breeding season?
Sure. Well, Mike did explain it well, but it's basically the breeding season is when the species might be breeding. That there's evidence out there that some of the birds will be breeding at that time, but the breeding season also includes, in most cases, the time when there will be migrants around. And so the safe dates are the sort of core of the breeding season when all the migrants have moved on and the only birds that are left are those that are breeding in the area. And so the safe dates, you're safe because the migrants are gone, all the birds around are very likely to be breeding. The wider breeding season, you still have the possibility of having some migrants passing through, so you got to be more cautious.
I think that clears it up for everybody, right? Mike Burrell and Kaylin, we have a super secret panelist too, guys, that we are going to call on at one point, and she's always hiding. But if any of you are already part of the Atlas, you know Kaylin well, and she's doing behind the scenes stuff, so she likes to hide, but she's an expert on all sorts of this stuff, so we will call on her later too. I forgot before, Kaylin, but I made a note to bring you up.
Feel free to reach out.
I'm sure a lot of them already do. Okay, so that's kind of helpful. The safe dates are smaller than the breeding season and then their safest time. One or two more just from Facebook before we move on to the Zoom questions. This is a pretty interesting technical question I don't know the answer to. So for the T breeding code, when you are within the safe dates and the bird's been in a single spot for a week and it's the same bird, Do all of the 7 days have to be within that time, the acceptable time, or can it just be the final day or part of the day? So to use the T code, do all 7 of the days have to be within the safe dates or not?
So
No, go ahead, Mike.
go ahead.
Okay, well, okay, I will. So the 7 days is basically a week, right?
Yeah.
It's a contiguous 7 days. And so, yeah, as long as the calendar days are extend over at least a week, and you have the same bird there at the beginning and the end, in breeding season, in breeding habitat, then it's safe to call it a T.
I think the question is, what if the beginning of that week isn't in the breeding season and the end of it is?
Okay, yeah, yeah. But yeah, these things do get tricky. Yeah, I would think that's probably safe. That you'd want to, if you go out the next day and it's gone, well, then you could probably say, okay, well, it wasn't safe to put that down as a T. But if the first day happens to be outside of that week, and then you get it for 6 days inside, I guess you could call it that again, assuming breeding season, assuming breeding habitat, and an indication like a singing bird, something that's clearly making an effort to defend a territory.
Mike, Burrell, or Kaylin, do you guys have anything to tack on to that? Okay. Okay, let's do a Zoom one. Let's see here, what's a good one. Okay, so if you hear 2 American woodcock, this is a very specific example, so these are fun ones. So say you hear 2 American woodcocks doing flight displays. Do you still use the D code or do you use the BE code? Somebody wants to know. Who wants to handle that one?
Yeah, so that's the D code. You've got 2 displaying together. So that's, the rule that I popped up there. If you only have one, then it's an S, so singing bird. But if you have more than one together, then you've got that interaction. And that's what's key on the D code.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, let's see what else.
Well, assuming there is interaction, like it really is about 2 birds responding to each other. So usually in a display, you've got a male displaying and a female watching, or that kind of thing. That is a display. In the case of a singing woodcock, he might be jumping around, but he's really doing the equivalent of a robin song. He's just promoting himself and saying, "Here I am, come mate with me." And in that case, it's essentially the same as singing. So if you have an interaction, if there's a female bird there, or the 2 males are fighting, that kind of thing, that's great. You can use that. It's the interaction part that makes it D versus song.
Okay, sounds good to me. And to this point, because there are some of these kind of thorny and somewhat tricky examples, especially for kind of newcomers to this, Nathan Garber has asked, does the app let you easily check safe dates in the field? Because I think that would be helpful. Mike, Burrell, actually, Kaylin, do you want to answer that? I know that you've been using the app too. You know a lot about it.
Yeah, I don't think the app currently has that capability to be able to tell you the safe dates in the field. So I know that I have mine kind of printed off and ready to go for when I go out. But yeah, maybe an update in the future, but not entirely sure on that one.
Yeah, I think the intent is that it will be built in eventually. It's just, it's apparently a tricky thing to do. It's liable to slow down the app quite a bit when that's required. So until that can be smoothed out, it's not going to be on there for a while.
Okay, and I do think it's kind of a little bit of good practice to kind of learn the breeding codes yourself. And I do know that we have a few comments here on both platforms that like, oh my God, this seems really, really scary. But when you do get out into the field and you can refer to them, even just on your phone, like from the website, it really does start to become clear incredibly quickly. So don't be intimidated and do try it out. But to that end, a few more questions. Somebody said this, they said they had a long-eared owl. They observed it before the safe dates, but they still called it an S because it's a bird of interest and they wanted to flag it. Was that the right thing? And if not, what should they have done? Mike Burrell, you haven't been up for a while. You want to answer that one?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say you should leave it blank. If you wanted to flag it, then you could contact your regional coordinator and run it by them. But if it's outside of the breeding season, outside of the safe dates, then there's really no way to know that for sure that bird is breeding in that area. So yeah, I would leave it blank, and you could run it by your regional coordinator. And I mean, the best thing is to go back and see if it's there again a week later. And if it is, and you're in the breeding season, then you can use the T code. That there's evidence that it's sticking around defending a territory.
Fair enough. Okay, this is something interesting, just kind of about how we double check some of the codes and things used. So can somebody explain a little bit about the process by which RCs kind of scrutinize the records, and just some of the ways that we kind of check that appropriate codes were used for the submitted data? Maybe Mike Cadman, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I think anything that's flagged, there will be flags so the regional coordinators can see it and they'll check on it. And so that there's flagging for all kinds of different things beyond the dates. I don't think the dates are actually going to be flagged per se. It's more rarity and the standard symbols that are on the data form. Those species are all going to be flagged, and the regional coordinators will check on that. And there's a whole process that we're in the process of developing that the regional coordinators will be checking on that. The dates, I don't think will be systematically checked unless they pop up as being truly unusual.
Okay, that's interesting to know. So if you have, not a bird that's common enough and not of interest, you may want to be extra careful about the codes that you submit, because they may not be scrutinized as closely.
Well, I'd say that the eBird kicks in as well. Is that we have one of the checks that happens is if it's outside the sort of expected time that birds are there using the eBird calendar, then that would flag them as something the regional coordinator should be checking on.
That's fair. Okay, here's another question that I think is really interesting, and we have a few that are kind of converging on this. So with a lot of species, I mean, we're having an incredibly early spring. A lot of people have noticed in a lot of ways, and some species, you see this on a lot of the birding forums, are showing up a couple of weeks early this year. Will the safe dates maybe need to be adjusted in light of this stuff, or not?
It's possible. I mean, that's why at that last slide I had, I said, please give us your feedback, and if we need to, we're going to adjust them. But I mean, in terms of the safe dates, I doubt the safe dates will move much. The breeding season, we might open that window more or less, but it's the sort of thing, if like everybody's reporting the same thing and everybody's saying it's breeding already, then yeah, we'll obviously adjust it. But yeah, we plan on them being adapted throughout the life of the atlas, so they're not going to stay the same. And we've already made several rounds of updates.
Yeah, and I'll just add, climate change is having a huge effect. Like, those numbers were based on long-term statistics, and it's clear that so many of the birds are coming back so much earlier than before, that it is making all of this much more difficult for everybody. And so, well, as Mike said, we'll try and adjust as we go, but we may not have time to really learn a lot during this 5 years. Maybe the birds are showing up earlier, but how much we can actually shift that into these safe dates and defining the breeding season and that kind of thing, is going to be, that would be a challenge to do. But what would probably result, I mean, we can, if there's obvious shifts, we can try and build those in, but it's probably just going to be trying to be a bit more flexible in terms of interpreting the information. If the regional coordinator is going to be aware that things are coming in earlier, and if you're reporting things a few days ahead of the breeding season, then you know, I think there's going to be more flexibility on that as we learn more.
And I think really something to keep in mind is that this is part of what the atlas is for, is figuring this out. So whether or not we can accommodate it kind of during this atlas period, well, the data collected during the atlas will help inform how we think of these things into the future. So that's really important.
Yeah, maybe just mention too, Emily, that a lot of these things are really hard to measure, right? Just birds are showing up and they're singing, and who knows if they're migrating through at that moment. Those kind of things are hard to measure. But when you start getting things like nests being produced, and you start getting young coming out of the nest, those kind of things, they're going to be very helpful. So we really encourage people to provide that kind of information as soon as that information is available, so that we can use that. We can use those to adjust dates. If it turns out these birds are, you know, coming out of the nest 2 weeks ahead of when they used to come out of the nest, that's going to be really helpful in terms of figuring out when they actually did get started and adjusting dates accordingly.
That's a good point. Okay, I'm not going to let Kaylin off the hook. I'm going to ask her a question now, and this is one that's come up a couple times. If you've put in, you know, a breeding code and you find out later that it's not the one that you wanted, or you want to change your breeding code based on, you know, looking some things up. Kaylin, do you know anything about how easy it is to go back in and edit your breeding code on your submitted data?
Yeah, I do spend a lot of time on Nature Counts, the database that we use for submitting our atlas data and figuring out the ins and outs. So when people come to me with questions, I can answer them. And so if you log into your Nature Counts, which is where you've submitted your data, people either submit it through the app or through the online portal, but you can only edit it through the online portal. So if you go online to Nature Counts and you log in, there's an Explore tab. And under that is explore and then review your data forms, explore data forms. And there will be an editing column, so you can edit any of your checklists and change the breeding evidence.
I'm sure that's a relief for everybody. So that's good to know. Another thing, I mean, people really want to refer to these safe dates. We've gotten a number of comments and questions about where to find all of this information. And I know Kaylin's probably really well situated to comment on that too. Like, where do you find these appendices and where do you find all of these resources on the website and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple places that you can find things, and each will be under the Tools and Resources tab on the website. So the first is under Tools and Resources. You can go to the Instructions and Forms page, and you can go to either the instructions for general atlasing from there, or the appendices, or the safe dates are also linked from there. Additionally, under the Tools and Resources, there is something just called Safe Breeding Dates. And if you click on that, then there will be a link to the safe dates charts ordered chronologically. There's also a version that is ordered taxonomically, and there's a link to Appendix H that Mike Burrell was talking about, which explains the breeding codes and when to use them.
There's so much information to look through, guys. Yeah, it does become simpler. Okay, so for our last few minutes, we have a lot of questions. It's been a little bit challenging to kind of organize them because we have so many individual kind of situations. So maybe just in the time we have left, I'll talk about an example situation, a little bit like the quiz. It's like the quiz reverse. I'm going to talk about a situation. You tell me what code it's supposed to be based on some of the questions that we've had. So here is one. Catherine Boothby says, I had a horned lark in my square singing in the same location for approximately 2 weeks. What do I do? Is it T? It is a little bit ahead of the safe dates. So who can tell me what code she should use? Any of the mics?
You should go ahead and use T. So horned lark is a cool one because, and it's a tricky one because in terms of their breeding season, because they start breeding in Southern Ontario really early, but they go all the way, some of them go all the way up to Hudson Bay, and those ones obviously aren't going to start nesting, until late May. So we do have migrants passing through still, even though they're well on their way in terms of the nesting in Southern Ontario. So if you've got a bird that's singing for more than a week, then you're in the breeding season outside of the safe dates, but T is one of those codes that you can use outside of the safe dates.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so Mike Cadman, you're up next. James Kirkland asks here, he had a northern saw-whet owl that was singing or calling in one spot for 7 days. And he's in the boreal area, right? So he's not in the mixedwood forest. It's in the light blue section on the safe dates. Should that be a T or should it not be recorded at all? And he says also, it might stop singing if it pairs up as well. So that's something that he wants to be aware of.
Yeah, I know, very much. Well, I think that sounds very much like the horned lark situation that Mike just described. Yeah, you're within the breeding season. It's there for a week. It's singing and advertising. So yes, that's a good case for a T. And as you say, they do tend to shut up once they get paired. So good to get that. Good to get that record.
Okay, let's do one more, and we'll just open this up. Whoever wants to answer first. So Kevin Shackleton says, he has an American crow bringing nesting material to a spruce within sight of his backyard and hanging around and hanging around the location. What code would that be?
If you see it, if it's nest building, it's nest building. That's just use the nest building code, and that would be confirmed breeding for a crow.
Okay. Do you want to maybe speak to some of the examples, like with the woodpecker excavations and the wrens, where nest building may not be nest building? Because that may be a bit confusing for some people too. Sure.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the rules apply for almost everything, but the woodpeckers and the wrens. The woodpeckers, they'll drill holes and they'll make nests just that they'll roost in. They don't actually nest in. And wrens build dummy nests and so the fact that they're building a nest doesn't necessarily indicate that they're breeding at that site. It's a really fine distinction, but it was adopted in the early days of atlasing, and I think it still makes sense because of that biological difference. But in the case of the wrens, those wrens are probably almost all going to be nesting, or at least they're attempting to nest at that site. But the woodpecker is a different one. Well, you'll get birds going in and out of roosting holes all through the winter. So it's not nearly as strong an evidence as the wrens might be. Okay, just when you thought it was simple. So we only have really 1 minute left. We did have a lot of questions, a lot of these kind of example-based questions, but I did want to leave us some time just to make some general atlasing announcements. There's a lot going on right now with the season starting. I don't know if Mike or Kaylin maybe wants to start just by making an announcement about the launch weekend or anything to do with that. Is that a good idea? Yeah, Kaylin, do you want to do that?
Yeah, sure. So I sent out an email to everyone about Sappy Hour, and it seems that many people got the memo. So if you did, that means you also got the email that kind of briefly mentioned the Atlas 3 launch weekend, which is going to be happening virtually. So that's going to be happening on the 24th and 25th. I think that's just 11 days away. And we're going to be holding different webinar sessions on atlasing kind of fundamentals is kind of the main point of it. So a lot of these questions may also be answered at that time. And we're also kind of giving an opportunity for more regional discussions as well on the Sunday. So we'll be releasing a bit more information about that shortly, but yeah, stay tuned and keep the weekend open for the 24th and 25th.
Especially your evenings, because we did try and we worked in some birding time for people. So not to worry, you can atlas and come to the launch weekend. Mike Cadman, do you have any other announcements that you wanted to cover before we sign off today?
I don't have anything in mind in particular. I encourage people to follow the COVID safety guidelines for your region very, very carefully. Obviously, safety's got to come first in all of this, so be cautious there. Good to know. We did have a couple of questions on that we didn't get to, so thank you for bringing that up. And Mike Burrell, anything from you that you wanted to mention about safety? I don't know, anything you've seen?
If you're feeling overwhelmed, just remember, the idea with the safe dates is just to prevent you marking breeding evidence when it could be a migrant. So basically, if you're outside of those safe dates, you want to make sure it's you're very confident on the breeding evidence. So one of those higher breeding evidence codes. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and that is a lot simpler than kind of when we get into the minutia of it. So yeah, I mean, this is actually a really good time, like Mike Cadman said, to kind of just get out and practice before you get completely overwhelmed by, the sheer number of birds. And yeah, try some of this stuff out in your local area, especially where it is safe to do so. I know we're all seeing a lot of things returning. I've been seeing wood ducks checking out nest boxes that I have on my property. I've been, seeing sapsuckers doing interesting things lately. So this is it. We're really starting to get going. And with that, I'm just going to end with our regular reminder that, if you wanted to go over any of the wisdom that was imparted by our panel tonight at your leisure, you can do so. The recording will be saved on Facebook. And also, when it's available, we're going to upload the recording of the video of tonight's session onto the Atlas 3 YouTube page. And the name of that YouTube page, we made it very easy, is called Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas-3. So you can find it on Facebook or YouTube going forward, along with a whole host of other resources and things to look through, videos, instructional videos, things like that as well. So thanks so much. And yeah, we'll see you hopefully at the launch weekend. And yeah, happy atlasing, everybody. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.